Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
I'm Frans De Waal. I'm a primatologist who works on bonobos and chimps and capuchin monkeys and macaques and elephants, which is not particularly a primate, but also, yeah.
Since we're standing here in front of a mirror, perhaps we could start off with empathy. What does empathy have to do with reflecting other people?
Well, we have the mirror neurons, which are definitely involved, even though no one knows exactly what they do in empathy, but they're probably involved. And mirror neurons are sort of interesting because they were discovered in monkeys. Everyone talks about them for humans as if we know a lot about them in humans, but we don't. For humans, we know actually very little about mirror neurons because we cannot do single cell recording in the neurons in the human brain unless you get a permission. Certainly, I would not give permission for that. So most people won't. So we have that evidence for monkeys, and mirror neurons are mentioned very much for being involved in imitation and being involved in empathy, which means that if that is the case, that we should extend the concept to other animals. It's not just a human concept, but it applies to other animals as well. Another connection with mirrors is that I believe to have more cognitive forms of empathy, you need to be able to draw a line between yourself and the other. So mirror neurons may help to cross the line and to fuse my mind with your mind, so to speak, or your body at least. But to have more advanced forms of empathy, we need to be able to draw a line between them, and I need to be able to say, well, these emotions come from him and not from me, and that's his situation and not my situation. I need to be able to make that distinction between self and other. And that distinction correlates, we think, with self-awareness as tested in mirror tests. Because, for example, in human children, when they're 2, they start to recognize themselves in the mirror, and that's also when they start to develop these more complex forms of empathy. So the self-awareness that they develop makes it possible for them to actually position themselves in the situation of somebody else. And I think the same is true for species, is that there are certain animals like elephants and dolphins and the great apes, but not the monkeys, who recognize themselves in the mirror, which allows them to have a more complex forms of empathy than other animals. I'm not saying that other animals don't have empathy, like let's say a dog. A dog doesn't recognize, or a cat doesn't recognize themselves in the mirror, but they have definitely, they respond to emotions, which is the basis of empathy, right there.
So I saw you had in the video, in your talk yesterday, you were showing elephants, and the elephant was standing in front of the mirror and kind of looking at a mark.
Yeah, so we did the mirror test on elephants, because 30 years ago, Gordon Gallup, who discovered mirror self-recognition in the apes, he had already speculated that it relates to empathy. He said, well, this self-awareness that we're testing in the apes probably relates to complex capacities like being empathic to others. And if that is true, he said, well, then we should expect mirror self-recognition in some other animals who are highly empathic, such as the dolphins and the elephants. Dolphins have been tested in the meantime, and elephants actually have also been tested, but they were tested with a very small mirror, and they had failed to test, and we decided that that's maybe due to the small mirror, because an elephant is a rather big animal. And so we set up a test at the Bronx Zoo. Josh Plotnick is the student who did that, who's now a doctor. He did that experiment, and he set up the experiment where elephants could approach a mirror, and they had a big mark above their eyebrow. Well, they don't have an eyebrow, above their eye. Above their eye. They had a big mark that they could not know about without the mirror. There's no way they could know about it. And we had a sham mark on the other side that was the same substance, so if it was related to smell, it would smell the same, but was not visible. So they were released and put in front of the mirror, and one of them clearly did pass the mark test, which is the ultimate test of self-awareness with mirrors. And so the elephants now have joined the club of animals who have that kind of self-awareness, and we also know of a lot of empathic behavior in elephants. It's not like that still needs to be documented carefully, but it's not like there's a lack of evidence of empathy in elephants.
So the reflection part is very, and
is part of it.
Yourself is very important then to one component of empathy.
Yeah, I'm not sure that recognizing yourself in the mirror is by itself an important thing, but it's more like a measure that we use to get at self-identity. So how strong is your self-identity? Recognizing yourself in a mirror for the biologist is really no big deal, because what is the adaptive significance of that? What does an animal do that recognizes itself in a pool of water, for example? I'm not sure that they do much with it. So the recognition part by itself is not so important. It's more that we get at the strengths of self-identity.
So maybe we can talk about then the how you define empathy. You have like a series of kind of a...
So empathy has many layers, in my opinion. So empathy, the most basic form is what we call emotional contagion. Is you're affected by the emotions of somebody else. And that starts in human life on day one. Babies already start to cry when they hear another baby cry. And it is visible in all sorts of animals, all sorts of mammals, I must say. I'm not sure that you're going to find it in reptiles and fish and so on. But certainly in all mammals you're going to find some degree of emotional contagion, which is the basis of empathy. And without that, I'm not sure you can even get to empathy. And then on top of that, we build more complex layers where you're not just affected by the emotions of somebody else, but you try to understand the emotions and you try to do something about the situation of somebody else. And that's much more complex. In the end, it requires that you can take the perspective of somebody else. And that's a cognitive ability that comes on top of it. And not all animals. So for example, dogs, I think, are very empathic animals. But I'm not sure that they're particularly good at taking the perspective of somebody else. But I do think apes and elephants, they have that capacity.
So what I'm looking at is, I mean, you kind of laid the groundwork of how empathy works at a biological level. Kind of my real interest is how do we actually create a culture that supports and encourages empathy within the society? And I was wondering if you have kind of thoughts on that and maybe how your work kind of influences that, or should we even try to do that?
Yeah. Well, the first step is, of course, to give empathy a positive sound, which it has gotten in the meantime. But I've spoken with scientists who started the study of empathy in humans, who said that 30 years ago, people laughed at you when you studied empathy. That was a sort of funny topic, which was in the same category as telepathy and astrology, and it was not a serious topic. So first of all, we need to make it a serious topic with a positive sound. And I think I'm doing that in part by talking about empathy in animals, and so that people don't look at empathy as some sort of new cognitive ability, but something that is deeply ingrained in human nature, which I think it is. As deeply ingrained as our mammalian heritage, which is 200 million years old. So I think that's one part of the mission, is to make empathy a positive word that we think is good for society. We have come out of a period where people thought that greed and selfishness was a positive word and good for society, which I don't think it particularly is. And with the collapse of the economy a couple of years ago, I think people have started to reflect on, is greed and selfishness really as good as it's advertised to be? And I'm not saying that we will ever have a society without selfishness and greed, and I'm not advocating that at all. But it's a balancing act that you need. You need the one and the other. You need solidarity on one level and capitalism, selfish capitalism on the other hand. So I'm not saying we need to exclude one or the other, but empathy used to be a sort of soft word that no one took seriously, and I think that has to change.
So now the word is starting to, the academics, yourself, very prominently have worked to kind of make it more popular and kind of explain how it works. And there seems to be a lot of other scientists kind of working on this, starting to work on this now to make it more popular and explain how it works.
Yeah, I think it is becoming a bigger topic in the sense that the neuroscientists are interested and are trying to do neuroscience on empathy. The economists and anthropologists are getting interested in finding that humans are actually more pro-social and more cooperative than we had always assumed. And then people in animal behavior, such as myself, we're trying to make the evolutionary connections. So yes, I think it's becoming a bigger topic now and a more respectable topic. And I envision that in the coming 25 years there will be an enormous amount of discoveries, things that we don't even know about yet, related to empathy.
Well, Paul Ekman told me, he said we need an empathy Manhattan project, was his solution.
Manhattan, okay.
At that level.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that, so you talked about making it, kind of popularizing, explaining it. What else can we do to kind of...
Well, then the other things, but I'm not an expert on that, is education and culture, of course. Cultural change and educational change that emphasize empathy more. I would also warn that empathy is not invariably positive. So people think that empathy is automatically a positive characteristic, but empathy can be used for bad purposes also. The car salesman who tries to sell you a crappy car for a high price, he's probably going to schmooze with you about sports or something, or the weather or whatever. He's going to show some empathy to you in order to draw you in, and then he sells you the crappy car. The torturer who tortures you, he needs to know what is painful and what is annoying to others, which is also a form of empathy. And so empathy is by itself actually a neutral characteristic that we can use for good and for bad. But we first need to understand how it works, I think, before we even get into how we're going to enhance it and under what circumstances and so on.
There seems to be a level of empathy where you really empathize so deeply that you kind of feel like you're self-submerged.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think it's really difficult to do, like you're saying with the car salesman, or something they're standing outside of them. So maybe that's like another level deeper of empathy, a more deeper form of empathy.
Yeah, I do think that males and females are different in this regard. I think the origin of empathy in mammals is female maternal care. Because the female needs to respond right away to the emotions of her offspring. And so I think women have probably a more profound kind of empathy. The mechanism is more developed, so to speak, and more automated than men. And I think men can switch back and forth. And I can like you one moment and be empathic and all of this, but then you slight me or you do something bad to me that I really don't like, and all of a sudden you become an enemy, and all my empathy is gone, and I'll get you one way or another. And I think men are like that. Men can turn the switch on it more than women. There's actually experimental evidence for that. And so when you talk about this empathy as merging with the other, and which would prevent you from exploiting the other, so to speak, I'm not sure that that completely applies to man. I think men always have that ability to step out of it.
Well, there's another, when I talk to a lot of people about empathy, they'll kind of dismiss it, and they'll say either people are totally selfish and all actions are out of selfishness, but then some people will go another level higher to kind of enlighten self-interest. Say that I'm selfish, but I'm being good because it's really serving my self-interest. How do you kind of explain that comment?
Yeah. Well, it is true that Americans love the self-interest story. They're very much in love with that, and they've always been, is that we do things for ourselves, and if in the meantime it also does good for others as a byproduct, that's wonderful, but we do it it's the Ayn Rand type of thinking, like we do everything for ourselves. I don't know why Americans like that kind of thinking so particularly much, because it's not particularly popular outside of the US. But that's sort of the mythology in this country, even though people are very friendly and generous, and they're not less empathic than anybody else, in my opinion. And de Tocqueville already noticed that in Americans. He's a Frenchman who came long ago to the US, and he noticed they love the self-interest story, but in real life, they're not like that. So it's a sort of amusing to me. Empathy is in a way self-interested, because I'm sure it evolved for reasons of survival, and like all characteristics that we have, they serve some purpose. But once it is there, it can be applied outside of that purpose. So once you have the empathic capacity, you can apply it to a stranded whale. Now, certainly empathy did not involve in our species to take care of a stranded whale. That's very unlikely. So humans have the capacity, and then they can apply it outside of the context for which it was originally intended. And we do that all the time with all sorts of characteristics that we have. And to call that then self-interested, I'm not sure that that's the right word for me. I would say it is an expanded use of the capacity, really, that we're talking about. And so you can empathize with other species, you can empathize with individuals that you don't know. You see a child fall and you sort of flinch, even though you don't know the child, but it's an automated reaction that we have. Has nothing to do with self-interest at that particular instant, but the capacity is, of course, evolved because in the end it was beneficial for us. Yeah.
But so it's once we have that capacity, it's an innate capacity, so we're not doing it out of self-interest, we're just embodying our capacity. So kind of like that.
So not every instant where you show empathy has a self-interest going.
Okay. So do you think the kind of my vision of working towards building a culture of empathy, does that seem like a valid quest? Or?
Well, I think it is important in society, especially at the moment, now that we have come out of this period where greed was so good, you know. I think it is important to emphasize that there are alternative ways of looking at society. As a society where solidarity is important and caring about others is important. For example, the whole healthcare debate in this country is sort of interesting in that regard. We call it health care. We don't call it health business. It is really health care because it comes out of the caring attitude that humans have towards sick people. That's where the whole concept comes from. And to try to turn it into a business concept is, in my opinion, not the right approach to a system of health care. And that's also why, for example, the European systems of healthcare are far superior to the American one because they have shied away from this business model, which really doesn't work for it.
So they're more about caring and empathy for the fellow citizens.
I'm not sure that the doctors in a European hospital would say we're in the empathy business. I'm not sure that they would call it something like that, but certainly it comes out of care, and they feel it's a responsibility to take care of people who are sick, and that society and the nation should help them in that, rather than looking at from the profit principle and saying how can we make money off people's backs, and as a result you get a healthcare industry like in this country where people pay far more for their healthcare and get actually far less for their healthcare.
So if you look over the kind of the arc of your life, you know, from your childhood to the present, how has empathy developed for you in the sense that when did you become aware of the term, and how did it become important to you? And
well, it's sort of interesting how this happened is because I had studied already in chimpanzees consolation behavior, and consolation is where one individual is distressed and others approach and embrace and kiss and groom or whatever, try to calm them down. And so I had studied this behavior in chimpanzees, and then I went to a conference on child behavior by developmental psychologists, where they said, well, this is how we study empathy. We bring people in the family, we instruct them to start crying, and then we see how young children respond to them, and if they go up to them and touch them and look at them and ask how they're doing and stuff like that, then we call that empathic concern. And I was thinking, well, if that's the behavior you're talking about, that's behavior that I know of my chimpanzees. So that's how, for me, the connection was made, is that I had a very descriptive term at the time, which is consolation behavior, which has, of course, some implications of empathy, but I wasn't calling it explicitly empathy. And so when I heard about these child studies, I thought, well, I'm actually studying empathy. And this is long ago, this is like at least 20 years ago, and then I started calling it empathy. At the beginning there was a lot of resistance to it by people who study animal behavior, mainly because they don't like that kind of terminology, they like more descriptive, neutral terms. But now I think it is more and more accepted that animals have some degree of empathy.
In terms of the work that you're doing on empathy, has it made you a more empathic person? Or how has it influenced your own?
I think I am a very empathic person, and actually in my work that's a very important thing, is that in order to watch animals every day and to see what they're doing and be interested in what they're doing, you need to empathize with them. And I do know some scientists who don't, and who keep more distance from what they're doing with their animals but I don't think they get the same kind of information. So in general, people like myself, and I'm not just myself, many field workers in primates, many of my students, many people that I know who work with the primates, most of them, they love these animals, that's why they get into it, and they empathize with them, and because they empathize with them, they have an investment in their lives, and they are more interested in their lives, and they get more out of it. So you could think maybe it colors the observation, but we are capable of keeping these things separate. If you ask me how many fights did happen in your chimpanzee group today and how much grooming, I can count that very objectively. So my empathy doesn't stand in the way of objective data collection. I can do both, as we can do with humans. You can empathize with humans at the same time collect objective information on the cholesterol level or whatever you're interested in. So for me, that's a very important part of the job, and I'm a very empathic person myself. Yeah.
Towards people as well? Is that
towards people too, yeah.
Okay, okay, well great. I don't want to
Okay.
keep you long. Okay,
thank you.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.